Alright, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our next video on evolution, and we're specifically going to be reviewing genetics to better understand how speciation occurs. Let's get started on our next video. So genes versus genes. We've already gone through and looked at genes thus far, and remember, all a gene is it's a region of DNA that is going to code for a specific thing in an organism. So it's a region that's going to go through, and it's going to code for specific proteins with the phenotype that we see in that organism. Now, Darwin goes through and realizes that these traits can be inherited among organisms, but he does not have the knowledge that Mendel goes through and generates during his time as a monk. So the variations that we see are determined by different alleles, and when I say variations, I'm talking about variations within specific organisms. So if we look at different snakes, you can see that the snakes look similar, but they are among different species here. And what we know is evolution is due to a change in alleles over time. So what we're seeing here and the difference between the physiology and the phenotype of these organisms has to do with the alleles and genetics. Fundamentally, everything is occurring at the genetic level and comes from the genes. So if we're reviewing what an allele is, well, remember, this allele is going to code, it's a specific region that's going to go through and code for a certain phenotype. And an allele is the different forms of that gene, and they will ultimately influence what the offspring goes through and looks like. So remember, we have genes from both mom and dad that are passed on to us, and because of that, we're going to get a phenotype that is going to be dependent upon, it could be a combination. This is all the stuff that we talked about in genetics when we talk about incomplete dominance, codominance, dominant and recessive. But remember, the allele is the different forms of those genes, those two specific forms. But we have to understand that the allele is the two different forms from both the male and the female chromosomes that are passed on to that organism. So remember, if we have, let's say we're coding for eye color here. Your dad might pass on a gene that codes for blue eye color. Your mom might pass a gene that codes on for green eye color. And remember, those two genes are going to work together. Those two alleles are going to go through and shape and ultimately affect what the eye color that you see in you is. So what do genes have to do with evolution then? Why are we going through and reviewing this? Well, we're going through and reviewing this because basically what we're looking at here is what we call population genetics. And this is the science that focuses on evolution within populations. And these populations are ultimately affected by these genes. So population genetics is basically the combination of evolutionary theory, everything that we've been looking at with Darwin, and then also the stuff that we've looked at with Mendel. Now, this is the thing we have to fundamentally understand here. Remember, based on what we discussed before, individuals do not evolve, populations evolve. So the genes do not change, rather evolution occurs over many generations of a species, and that's where we see those genetic differences. If we look at the horse has not evolved over one individual organism. It's taken generations and generations and generations of populations to go through and create the modern horse that we go through and see today. So if we're thinking about these terms, we've been throwing around these terms, and we've already gone through at the very beginning of the year, we talked about what a population is. And a population is the number of organisms of the same species that live in a particular geographic area at the same time. And sometimes people will throw around population and species kind of as the same term. But if we look at species, well, a species more specifically is defined as a group of individuals that actually or potentially interbreed in nature. So in this sense, a species is the biggest gene pool possible under natural conditions. Now I pull up this picture of these spiders here. Are these spiders of the same species here? We call these the happy spiders because if you look at that spider, you can kind of see this happy face. The third spider in from the left, actually you see that kind of red smiley face there. So, what is going to classify an organism being in the same species? Well, if we have two clownfish, these clownfish are among the same species. Obviously they look alike, but what we're going through in determining whether or not they're the same species is whether or not they can reproduce and produce fertile offspring. We know that this fish and this toucan are not of the same species because if they tried to reproduce, they would not create any offspring, or they wouldn't be able to create any fertile offspring. So really what we're talking about here, and the fundamental rule that we have to understand when discussing species, is the ability for them to go through and reproduce. And the thing, if we're looking at the spiders here, well, they don't necessarily have to look the same. They don't all have to look exactly the same if we're looking at that phenotype. But They have to have the ability to reproduce and produce fertile offspring. That's what we're going through when we're talking about species, when we're throwing around that term. So, do species have to look like each other? Well, the short answer here is going to be no. Species are not required to look like each other, and in order for them to be the same species, they fundamentally have to have the ability to reproduce. So if we see the happy-faced spiders, they look different, but they can interbreed, and they are considered the same species because they can produce fertile offspring. Now, these species are going to go through and be affected by the alleles present. This is what we're getting into when we talk about population genetics. So I have a red bird and I have a blue bird, right? And we're going back to genetics and really reviewing this. So remember, we had the phenotype. That's what we're seeing with the birds, whether or not they're red or blue. And then we also have the genotype. And when we're looking at genotype, we're looking at the presence of what alleles are there. So B is going to be dominant. We're just going to do basic dominant recessive. Blue is going to be recessive here. So in order to get the red bird, we can have big B, or we can have big B, little b. In order to get the blue bird, we can have little b here. That's going to be the two recessive alleles that get the phenotype for the blue bird here. So what does this have to do with evolution? Well, when we talk about population genetics, we study the alleles of these organisms and how they affect the population. And we can also refer to this as microevolution because we're going through and looking at small differences that are going to affect the population. So basically from all of this, we can get two types of evolution that we can go through and delve into based on looking at the genetics. So if we look at microevolution, well, this is occurring over a relatively short period of time within a population. And this is going to be something that we look at when we discuss Darwin's finches. Now, when we talk about macroevolution, well, this is occurring over large geologic time. This is things like the fossil record and things like biogeography that are occurring over long periods of time and many generations. So really this next section of evolution that we're going through and looking at, we've already gone through and looked at macroevolution. What we're trying to do is understand how genetics now is playing a role when we go through and discuss evolution. So we can break it into two subsets, and now we're going through and looking at microevolution at play. So here's the thing that we have to understand. Within any population, there's going to be a variation among individuals. And if we go through and plot the trait on the x-axis and the number of offspring on the y-axis, in almost all circumstances, what we're going to get is this bell-shaped curve. Now this bell curve is going to go through and represent, in this case, we're looking at size of these fish. And what it's representing in the middle is the average traits are going to be the most common. And then what we see is these unaveraged traits, either a really large or really small fish, are going to occur at the other sides of this bell curve. Now, fundamentally, genetics is going to play a role in this variation in traits. But there's also going to be other factors that go through and affect it. Environmental factors can affect an organism. The random pairing of genes, which we're going to go through and look at. Mutations, which is occurring at the genetic level, and then genetic recombination. All of these things have an effect on that organism and what those organisms look like and how they evolve over time. So really our ultimate goal now is to go through and look at evolution from a micro point of view, to look at it genetically, and then to go through and look at how genetics now plays a role. Now that we have an understanding of how modern genetics influences organisms, we want to go through and look at how that plays a role and how organisms evolve based on their genes. All right, so did you learn? Well, did you learn a couple of things? Did you guys go through and review genetics and some of the terms that we kind of threw around in our last 2 units? Did you guys go through and do you understand what a species is now? It's an organisms that have the ability to go through and reproduce and create fertile offspring. It does not mean that they have to look exactly the same. And then lastly, do you understand what macro versus microevolution is? And do you understand that now we're going through and we're kind of zooming in our lens and looking at microevolution? So this is going to be the end of the video. I will see you all in class tomorrow.